Chapter 14. A Midnight Chase. Immediately, the Pattersons hurried to Nancy's side, followed by Bess and George. The young sleuth was down on hands and knees outside a basement window that was almost completely hidden by a heavy growth of shrubbery. "Careful where you walk," she called out. "Here are some peculiar footprints." The others followed Nancy's pointing finger. Deeply embedded in the sodden dirt were the prints of a three-toed bird. Sheila looked alarmed. In a trembling voice she asked, "Do they belong to a peacock?" "Yes and no," Nancy replied ambiguously. The others waited for her to explain. After making some measurements, she looked up and said, "See these marks? Sometimes they're close together, and at other times far apart." "What does that prove?" Bess asked. "It means," said Nancy, "that a human being and not a bird made these marks." Annette paled. You mean a human being with a bird's feet?" she questioned. Nancy said that she believed the human being had strapped artificial peacock claws to the bottom of his shoes to avoid making footprints that might be recognizable. Bess asked her if she had any theory about who the intruder had been. "Yes," Nancy replied. "I think it was our ghost friend, and he's more interested in peacocks than we figured. But first, I'd like to prove my theory about these footprints. Let's follow the marks." The group had no difficulty doing this. The prints were visible as far as Eddie Run. Here they vanished, and there were no imprints of any kind, bird or human, along the shoreline. "Maybe the spook can fly," George quipped. As the group turned back toward Ivy Hall, Nancy's eyes swept the entire area. Suddenly, she dashed off a short distance and picked up an object embedded in the mud. "I found the answer!" she exclaimed exultantly. Coming back to the others, Nancy showed them a bronze cast of a peacock's foot with straps attached. "It must have dropped off the man's shoe," she said. "I presume this bird man came and went in a boat, so there's no chance of following him." As the group walked back to the house, everyone discussed this new angle of the mystery. But when they reached Ivy Hall, Sheila insisted that all sleuthing cease for the day. "This is the strangest Sunday I've ever spent in my life," she said. "I think we all should have a little spiritual uplift." "But I don't feel," said Annette, "that we should leave the house for long." Sheila nodded. With dramatic steps, she marched to an old-time organ in the parlor, opened it, and began to play hymns. Though it wheezed a bit and some notes did not sound, the girls managed to keep in tune and joined her in singing for over an hour. The serene atmosphere was relaxing, and the mood remained until bedtime. Then Sheila began to worry again. "I won't sleep a wink," she said, "unless everything in Ivy Hall is nailed tight shut. There seems to be all kinds of entrances to this old house that we can't find, but others can use. The ghost must have come through that basement window, and we didn't even know it was there." Nancy agreed that this was true. She suggested that the regular cellar doors be securely bolted, the secret entrance to the tunnel nailed shut, and the trapdoor in the attic covered with a heavy trunk. "And I'll disconnect the mechanism in the wall," she said. Taking a flashlight and a screwdriver, she went to the third floor and deftly removed the spring and lever. Returning to the others, she remarked, "If we hear footsteps in this house tonight, Sheila, I'll almost agree with you that our visitor is supernatural." Everyone went to bed early and soon fell asleep. Nancy, with the various mysteries on her mind, woke up at about midnight. Wondering why, she listened intently. There was not a sound in the old house. Smiling to herself, the girl detective turned over and fell asleep once more. Some time later, she awoke again. There was no mistaking the reason this time. Outside her window, she heard screeching sounds. They were the same as those she had heard coming from inside the walls of Cumberland Manor. Jumping from her cot, Nancy looked out the window. She could see nothing on the lawn below. By now, the screeching had awakened Bess and George. "How horrible!" Bess cried out. "Where is it?" She and her cousin hopped out of bed and hurried to Nancy's side. Still, nothing could be seen outside. "I'm going down to find out what's going on," Nancy said. As she pulled on bathrobe and slippers, George said she and Bess would go along. Nancy grabbed her flashlight and hurried to the first floor. She swung open the front door and rushed down the steps, beaming her light ahead of her. In its glare stood a magnificent peacock, its fan fully spread. "Oh!" Bess exclaimed. "The story's true!" At that moment, Sheila and Annette appeared on the porch. When the actress saw the bird, she cried out in terror, then fainted. As Sheila slumped to the floor, Bess and Annette caught her and carried the unconscious woman indoors. "Don't worry, girls," said Annette. "Mother often does this." George remained with Nancy. The girl detective, meanwhile, had swung her flashlight in a wide arc over the area beyond the peacock. For a fraction of a second, Nancy thought she glimpsed the figure of a crouching man, but when she turned the light back, he was gone. By this time, the peacock had recovered from the hypnotism caused by the light shining directly in his eyes. Folding his tail, he began to run across the lawn. "Let's follow him, George," Nancy whispered, keeping her flashlight trained on him. The bird ran faster than the girls had any idea he could. They had a hard time keeping up with the peacock as they followed him across a field. "He's going into the woods," George said suddenly. "We may lose track of him." The girls ran even faster, their robes flapping in the slight breeze that had sprung up. The peacock followed a path among the trees, which ended at Eddy Run. Now the bird turned left along the shore. Sloshing through the mud, Nancy and George kept pace with him. "I wonder how far he's going," George asked. She chuckled and added, "I've been on some crazy chases with you, Nancy Drew, but this one's the prize." Nancy agreed that it did seem absurd to be chasing a peacock at this hour. "If my hunch that he's going to Cumberland Manor is wrong," she said, laughing, "I'll carry you back home. But we're not far from Mr. Honcho's estate now, and maybe—" As she spoke, the peacock disappeared. Apparently, he had run behind a high mass of bushes. Nancy started around the corner of the tangled shrubbery, with George close behind. Holding the flashlight directly in front of her, Nancy hoped to catch sight of the big bird again. Instead, the light picked up a white-sheeted figure. "The ghost!" George exclaimed. If the masquerader had hoped to frighten the two girls into fleeing, he failed. Instead, they ran directly toward the figure, which took to its heels around the shrubbery and vanished. Nancy and George continued the search, but their advance was suddenly halted a few minutes later. A stream of water hit both girls in the face full force. It knocked them to the ground, and Nancy's flashlight went out. End of Chapter 14.